The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn as Laura Bennett pushed the medication cart down the third-floor corridor of Oak Creek Memorial, her movements practiced and efficient, invisible as smoke. She wore her navy scrubs like camouflage, her dark hair pulled back so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes, her name badge, Just Hell Bennett, RN, facing inward against her chest. The antiseptic smell of bleach mixed with something underneath, something older, the copper-edged fear that lived in hospitals the way mold lives in basement corners. Under her narrow bed 6 blocks away, beneath a mattress that sagged on one side from years of uneven weight distribution, sat a pair of worn combat boots. The leather was cracked along the seams. The soles were scuffed down to bare rubber in 2 specific places, the ball of the left foot and the heel of the right, from a particular kind of running through particular kinds of terrain. She touched those boots every morning before work. She hadn't worn them in 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. She could not throw them away. She could not let anyone see them. She could not explain why a civilian nurse would need military footwear that still carried the dust of Tikrit in its treads. Laura Bennett moved through the corridors of San Diego's Oak Creek Memorial the way someone moves through a life they've borrowed by mistake. When the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, Dr. Marcus Hargrove stepped out, his Italian leather shoes clicking against tile with a sound like a timer ticking down. He was watching her. She felt it the way animals feel weather changes, a shift in air pressure, a subtle warning encoded in the hindbrain. His eyes followed her as she checked the medication cart's inventory log, as she stopped to listen to a patient's complaint about pain levels, as she documented her observations in the electronic chart with the kind of meticulous attention that made her handwriting look printed. Hargrove was 53 years old, carried himself like a man who'd never lost an argument, and had been skimming insurance payments through inflated equipment orders for the better part of a decade. His scheme was simple and elegant: requisition cardiac monitors at 200% markup, bill the insurance companies, pocket the difference. The hospital got its equipment. The insurers paid. The numbers balanced. Nobody looked too closely. Nobody except nurses like Laura, who counted supplies the way other people counted money, who cross-referenced inventory logs against purchase orders, who noticed when equipment appeared in the system without appearing in the physical storage closets. He studied her from the nurse's station, his gaze sharp as a scalpel. The way her hands trembled slightly during shift change. The way her shoulders locked whenever a gurney crashed through the double doors and the alarm bells shrieked their codes into the recycled air. The way she flinched at loud voices, her entire body going rigid for exactly 3 seconds before she forced it back down, muscle by muscle, like lowering something heavy into deep water. These tells were useful. These tells meant vulnerability. These tells meant threat. Because what Hargrove didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that those same trembling hands never hesitated during a code. When the monitors flatlined and the room became a controlled explosion of movement, Laura's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators. 18-gauge needles found veins on the first attempt, every time. For bags hung from poles with the exact angle and height that maximized flow. Medications were drawn, calculated, and administered with the kind of muscle memory that came from doing the same tasks in sandstorms while under fire, when hesitation meant someone died. He didn't see the legend. He only saw the liability. The 3rd floor of Oak Creek Memorial's cardiac unit was organized in the manner of all American hospitals, patient rooms arranged in a semicircle around a central nursing station, monitors displaying continuous readouts of electrical impulses and oxygen saturation, the faint beep-beep-beep of machines keeping time with human hearts. The smell here was different from the rest of the hospital. More acidic. The sweat of fear mixed with the sweat of exertion, the particular metallic tang of cardiac medications, the ghost scent of adrenaline that never quite washed out of the walls. Laura began her morning rounds at 6:50, 8 minutes before shift officially started because she always arrived early, always prepared, always ready. The kind of early that suggested someone with nowhere else to be. The kind of ready that suggested someone who'd learned a long time ago that preparation was the only thing that separated survival from catastrophe. Room 312 was empty. Room 314 held Mr. Patterson, 67, post-MI, doing fine. Room 316 held Mrs. Cho, 72, arrhythmia, already awake and anxious. Laura did her assessments, checked her charts, documented everything. The kind of charting that could be cross-referenced against supply inventories. The kind of documentation that made patterns visible. Then they brought in the new admission. The gurney came through the double doors at 7:17 a.m., pushed by transport with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd done this 9,000 times before. Room 318. The patient was conscious, alert, stable. Major William Cross, admitted for post-operative cardiac monitoring following a routine follow-up procedure. The transfer sheet indicated he was Special Forces, discharged honorably, no current medications, no allergies, no known complications. Laura was assigned his intake. She approached the bedside without rushing, her movements economical and professional, her voice measured at the pitch that calmed anxious patients. "Good morning, Major. I'm Laura. I'll be your primary nurse today. How are you feeling? Any chest discomfort? Any shortness of breath?" She placed the blood pressure cuff on his right arm. The left arm bore a tattoo, old enough that the black ink had faded slightly to a blue-gray, letters in a precise military block print, Bennett. He was mid-40s, lean in the way that came from decades of physical training, his face weathered by sun and something else, the kind of weathering that came from looking at things a human being shouldn't have to look at. His eyes were grey-green, the color of a stormy Atlantic, and they tracked her movements as she worked. "Never better," he said. His voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd been intubated. "Just the usual post-op magic." Laura didn't meet his eyes as she documented his vitals. BP 132/81. Heart rate 86. Respiratory rate 18. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air. All normal. All exactly what you'd expect from a stable cardiac patient on day 2 of recovery. She placed the cardiac monitor leads on his chest with efficient precision, watching as the green line painted itself across the monitor, a perfect sine wave of electrical impulses marching across the screen in their ancient rhythm. The tattoo on his forearm said Bennett. Her name. Not the same as her name, but close enough. Close enough that something in her chest made a decision it wasn't meant to make. Some part of her that was buried so deep she'd convinced herself it didn't exist anymore suddenly woke up, sniffed the air, and began tracking a scent only it could smell. She didn't look at his face. Didn't look at the tattoo a second time. Didn't give the slightest indication that she'd noticed. Her composure held like reinforced concrete, smooth and uncracked. She completed his intake, reviewed his medications, set his alarm parameters, and moved to the next patient without a pause in her rhythm. But she made a mental note. Room 318. Major William Cross. Tattooed forearm. Special Forces. Hargrove was waiting at the nurse's station when she came back to document. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression arranged in the kind of casual disapproval that made junior staff nervous. Laura kept her eyes on the computer screen as she entered her notes, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she applied to everything else. "Your charting was flagged again," Hargrove said. His voice was pleasant. This was the dangerous version of his voice. Excessive notation on the supply discrepancy between ordered quantities and physical inventory. Laura kept typing. "It's an accuracy concern. The numbers don't match. The numbers are fine." He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, expensive, aggressive, the scent of someone who needed the world to know he was successful. "You're creating work for people who don't appreciate it." She finished her entry and logged out. When she turned to face him, her expression was blank as a hospital wall. "I'm documenting what I observe." "You're being difficult," he said. Not angry. Worse than angry. Concerned, like a teacher concerned with a student's behavior. That's not helpful in a collaborative environment. And that was when she understood, with the kind of clarity that came from years of reading danger signs, that she'd made a mistake. The mistake was being too good at her job. The mistake was being too careful, too precise, too meticulous in ways that eventually added up to exposure. He'd seen her hands tremor. He'd seen her flinch. And he was beginning to understand that those tells didn't belong to someone fragile. They belonged to someone broken, and broken people who could still function at this level were dangerous in ways that soft people never were. What happened next didn't just happen in silence. It happened underneath silence, in the space between heartbeats, in the pause before a storm moves inland. Laura nodded, accepting the correction she hadn't deserved and wouldn't acknowledge. She stood, excused herself, and returned to her rounds. Room 316. Room 318, she paused longer at his door, checking his monitor, noting his vital signs, making sure the equipment was functioning at optimal parameters. Major Cross was sleeping, his face relaxed in the way that only people accustomed to rest amid chaos could achieve. The tattoo on his forearm spelled out Bennett in letters that looked almost official. She had no idea that the man in that bed had once carried her body armor for 3 miles through hostile fire. That he'd memorized the exact pitch of her voice so he could find her in the darkness. That her name had been tattooed onto his skin while she was being put back together in a military hospital, the kind of hospital that specialized in putting soldiers back together with pieces that didn't quite match up anymore. He had no idea that the woman checking his vitals was the person that tattoo was meant to summon, like a curse or a prayer. Neither of them knew that the moment Major Cross arrived at Oak Creek Memorial, the countdown had begun. Morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial moved like a ritual no one questioned anymore. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical prayer above trauma bays and recovery rooms, and Laura Bennett moved through it all like a ghost, present, useful, invisible. She had perfected the art of occupying space without demanding it. Major William Cross's room was on the cardiac recovery wing, third door on the left, and she was adjusting his medication drip when she heard Hargrove's voice in the corridor, that particular cadence that made every nurse on the unit tighten their shoulders. He entered with 2 residents trailing behind like remoras following a shark, and Rebecca Cross, the Major's adult daughter, stood near the window pretending to check her phone. Laura kept her hand steady on the fall line. The medication was trickling through perfectly, pain management following the standing orders she'd implemented the previous day when the Major complained of breakthrough discomfort in his surgical site. She documented it meticulously. Everything was by protocol. Nurse Bennett, Hargrove said, his voice loud enough to carry authority without shouting. I need to discuss your unauthorized treatment modifications. Again. Laura took one measured breath. She didn't turn from the drip. The patient was experiencing breakthrough pain. I followed standing orders for. You followed your own judgment. Hargrove stepped closer, positioning himself between Laura and the Major, a calculated move that made Rebecca look up from her phone. Which frankly concerns me given your limited experience at this facility. The words landed exactly as he intended, a public questioning of her competence, delivered in the presence of the family member most likely to believe it. Laura's hands didn't shake. They didn't fumble. They completed the task with the same precision that had once reassembled wounded soldiers under fire. Major Cross's daughter has every right to question whether her father is receiving competent care from someone who seems to prioritize improvisation over established protocols. Hargrove turned to Rebecca with her expression of practiced sympathy, the kind that came from years of managing liability rather than patience. I apologize for my staff's overreach. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. The doubt had planted itself in her face like a seed. That was the real weapon, not the confrontation itself, but the seed of doubt that would grow in the minds of families, colleagues, administrators. Laura had seen this technique before, just never from a doctor. The military taught humiliation differently. It was direct, it was loud, it was meant to break you in front of your unit. This was something else. This was surgical. A tear escaped. Not from her eyes watering, but from the precise moment when her body betrayed the composure her mind had built. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist. One tear. Just one. And then she turned to face Hargrove directly, maintaining eye contact as the fluorescent light caught the moisture on her cheek. I've been dishonorably accused before, Doctor. Her voice came out low, steady as a pulse on a monitor. By better men than you. And the truth waited for me then too. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His face flushed a shade that suggested blood pressure elevation. The two residents looked at their shoes. Rebecca took a half step back. "That attitude," Hargrove said, his voice dropping but not losing its edge, "is exactly what I'm documenting." He turned to Rebecca again, his expression reorganizing itself into concern. "I apologize for my staff. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came later, when the morning rounds ended and the hospital settled into its midday rhythm. That's when the loneliness began. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial was a fluorescent-lit purgatory with a refrigerator that hummed like a dying animal, a coffee maker that hadn't been cleaned in 3 months, and a central table where the veteran nurses gathered like a jury. Laura entered at 12:13 p.m. with her thermos of cold tea and a paperback novel she hadn't been able to focus on since Tuesday. 4 of them were there: Sharon, who'd been at the hospital for 18 years, Linda, who always remembered everyone's birthday, Pam, who brought homemade brownies every Friday, and Joyce, who'd trained Laura during her first week. The moment Laura sat at the adjacent table, Sharon stood. Her chair scraped against the linoleum floor, a sound like bone on stone. "Come on," she said to the others, not looking at Laura. "We can finish this in the lounge." One by one they filed out. Pam wouldn't make eye contact. Linda paused at the door, something apologetic crossing her features. "Nothing personal, Bennett. Just hospital politics, you know." She closed the door behind her with the kind of gentleness that felt like a coffin lid. The break room emptied. The refrigerator hummed. Laura sat alone with her lukewarm soup, her unopened book, and the understanding that she'd become contagious. Association with her would become association with whatever narrative Hargrove was constructing. The smart move was distance. The safe move was silence. She opened her book. The pages didn't turn for 20 minutes. They just sat there, the words a blur of black on white that meant nothing. Thursday afternoon arrived like every other afternoon, except for the red ink. Laura approached the main unit board where assignments and patient updates were posted, where the rhythm of the hospital was communicated to anyone who needed to know what was happening. Hargrove had used red ink, the color reserved for alerts, warnings, dangerous situations. He positioned his work right in the center where the board held the greatest visibility. Disciplinary notice, Deld Bennett. Medication discrepancy investigation ongoing. Patient complaint filed regarding unprofessional conduct. Probationary status extended. Below it, 2 more notices from previous weeks. A trail of red ink like blood drops. Every staff member who passed would see it. Every patient family who asked questions would see it. Every administrator, every student, every visiting specialist would see it. That was stage 3 of his escalation, she realized. Not just accusations anymore. Documentation. Weaponized paperwork. The kind of thing that couldn't be unfiled, that created a permanent record, that would follow her to references and background checks and the next interview at the next hospital in the next city where she tried to disappear. Laura removed none of them. She didn't even consider it. She took one measured breath, touched the corner of the top paper with her fingertip once, a gesture that was part acknowledgement, part prayer, and returned to her rounds. 2 medical students whispered as they read the notice. She heard the nickname circulating now, Clipboard. For her meticulous documentation. For the way she checked and double-checked and never took shortcuts. The thing that should have protected her had become proof of something wrong. That evening, Sharon cornered her by the medication room. The older nurse's expression carried something that might have been regret or might have been self-preservation. The 2 looked identical from the outside. "Look, Clipboard," Sharon said, and hearing the nickname from someone who'd trained her felt like a specific kind of betrayal. "Maybe this job isn't for you. Have you thought about urgent care? Somewhere less complex." Laura's hands trembled. She felt them shake. She pressed them against her scrubs, steadied them through breath, and looked at Sharon directly. Her voice came out calm, almost clinical. "I'll consider that." But by Friday morning, Hargrove had escalated again. By Friday morning, the machinery was in full motion. By Friday morning, everything changed because a former patient returned to the hospital and his body decided to betray him in the one moment when it mattered most. The routine follow-up was scheduled for 10:15 a.m. Major William Cross arrived with Rebecca, both of them expecting a simple assessment, a continuation of the recovery process that had been moving forward smoothly. Laura was assigned to his intake, vitals, the standard checklist, the measurements that made up the mechanical heart of nursing. She approached the task like she approached everything, with precision and efficiency. As she placed the pulse oximeter on his finger, she felt his eyes on her, studying her face with the kind of intensity that came from a memory trying to surface but not quite breaking water. "Do I know you from somewhere?" he asked. Laura's hand froze. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone watching to notice. But she felt it internally, the moment when recognition threatened to rupture everything. She'd changed her hair 2 years ago. The weight loss from stress was significant. She'd buried her past deep enough that even the man whose life she'd carried through Tikrit couldn't find her in this diminished version of herself. The woman he'd known had moved with authority. This woman moved like she was trying to take up less space. "I don't think so, Major." "Common face," she said quietly, and turned toward the door to complete the rest of the assessment. That's when his oxygen saturation dropped. 92%. Not alarming yet. Acceptable. But the trajectory was wrong. She watched the monitor as she grabbed the blood pressure cuff from the wall. His breathing had changed, shorter, shallower, the pattern of someone whose lungs had decided to stop cooperating. He gasped, one hand moving to his chest, his face losing color in the way that meant the oxygen wasn't reaching where it needed to go. 88%. Rebecca screamed. That particular sound that comes from a family member watching their worst fear begin to materialize. "Dad? Dad!" Laura hit the code button. The alarm that followed brought every available staff member into motion. She was back at the bedside in 2 seconds, an eternity in the language of catastrophic vital signs. The Major's head was tilted back. His neck veins distended like cords. His trachea had shifted left, his breathing absent on the right side of his chest. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, compressing the heart, fatal without intervention. Fatal within minutes. Possibly fatal within seconds. Dr. Hargrove rushed in with 2 residents. Laura watched his face as he processed the monitor, the Major's deteriorating condition, the liability implications of what was about to become a medical emergency. His hands didn't move toward a treatment tray. His feet didn't carry him toward the equipment. He stood there, calculating the risk, the paperwork, the documentation, the exposure. "We need a chest tube tray," he said, but it was a hope, not a command. "We need to transfer him to." "There's no time," Laura said quietly. The Major's lips were turning blue. His oxygen sat at 84% and still falling. Laura moved. She didn't think about Hargrove. She didn't think about her reputation or her documentation or the red ink on the unit board. Muscle memory overrode everything else, took the wheel, pushed the conscious mind to the passenger seat, moved her hands through the sequence her body had learned in Tikrit when the sandstorms came and the trauma bay couldn't wait for protocol. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand before her mind caught up. She palpated the Major's second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The precise anatomical landmark. She felt it through her fingertips, the space between the ribs, the thin membrane of skin, the boundary between life and death on both sides of one needle's width. She pushed through. The needle slid home. The hiss of released air filled the small room, the sound of death reversing course, of pressure equalizing, of a body deciding to keep working. It was the same sound she'd heard in tents and trucks and the back of Hums carrying men whose names she still remembered. The Major's oxygen saturation began climbing. 86, 89. 93, his color returned like someone was painting him back into existence. His breathing deepened. Rebecca was crying, her hands gripping her father's arm. The attending physician who'd arrived during the procedure stepped back in shock. "Where the hell did you learn to do that?" Laura's hands were steady now. They'd stopped trembling the moment they had a purpose. Her eyes were distant, somewhere else, somewhere she didn't want to be. Trauma rotation, she lied, and the lie came out smooth as trained muscle. Hargrove stood against the wall, watching her with narrowed eyes. He recognized the threat, not to the patient, but to his narrative. This level of skill invited questions. Questions invited scrutiny. Scrutiny exposed everything. And everything about Laura Bennett was something he could not afford to let surface. Friday morning arrived with the kind of clinical precision that made hospitals run on time and patients show up exactly when scheduled. Major William Cross sat in the cardiac assessment bay at 9:06 a.m. with his daughter Rebecca beside him, both of them dressed in weekend clothes like people who expected this to be routine. His chart sat in Laura's hands, vitals from his last visit, EKG strips showing sinus rhythm steady at 68 beats per minute, ejection fraction measured at 52% and climbing. Everything looked like recovery. Everything looked like a man who'd been carried 3 miles through hostile fire in Tikrit and lived to sit in a hospital gown 5 years later. Laura moved through the assessment with the kind of methodical precision that had kept soldiers alive in field conditions where hesitation meant death. She placed the cardiac monitor leads with her fingertips, feeling for the anatomical landmarks beneath his chest wall. The adhesive pad stuck to his skin. The monitor began its steady electronic whisper, beep, 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 the sound of a heart doing what it was supposed to do. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The Major had made it clear in their previous encounters that he saw nothing in her face worth recognizing, and that invisibility was armor she'd learned to wear like second skin. Deep breath for me, she said, her voice the measured cadence of 1,000 routine assessments. The stethoscope went to his chest, left anterior axillary line, 5th intercostal space. Clear lung sounds bilaterally. His breathing was easy, unforced. Rebecca sat in the chair beside him reading something on her phone, the kind of comfortable presence that meant she'd stopped worrying weeks ago. The monitor's rhythm remained steady. Beep. 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 Dr. Hargrove entered the bay at 10:03 a.m. with the kind of deliberate timing that suggested he'd been watching from the hallway. He carried himself like a man who'd just won something significant, his shoulders back, his jaw set in the expression of someone whose phone calls had been answered, whose favors had been collected, whose machinery was already in motion. He barely acknowledged Laura. That was the point. She didn't exist anymore. She was already gone from this place, the paperwork just hadn't caught up yet. Major Cross, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the warmth of a surgeon who'd never raised his voice in his life because he'd never needed to. How are we feeling today? Any chest pain, shortness of breath, exertional symptoms? Clean bill of health, the Major said. Cardiologist cleared me for light activity 2 weeks ago. Just the follow-up now. Laura continued her assessment. Blood pressure 118/76. Pulse strong at the radial artery, steady beneath her fingertips. The kind of vitals that belong to a man healing. She made notes in the chart, clean findings, normal assessment, no acute distress. Just a nurse documenting what she saw, what she felt beneath her hands, what the machines were telling her in their digital language. 10:17 a.m. The monitor's rhythm shifted. It was subtle at first, the kind of change that would register on a nurse's awareness before her conscious mind caught up. The beat became less regular. The waveform on the monitor screen flattened slightly, the electrical impulses losing their amplitude. Laura's eyes went to the screen. She was already moving. Not rushed. Not panicked. Just the automatic response of someone whose body had learned long ago what certain patterns meant. Major Cross, she said, her voice unchanged. His hand went to his chest. His breathing became audible, a sharp inhalation, then silence. Then another. His face shifted from composed to confused in the space of a single heartbeat. I can't breathe, he said. Hargrove stepped forward, his expression moving from professional interest to professional concern. He reached for the blood pressure cuff as if moving through a script he'd memorized years ago. Rebecca stood up. The monitor's rhythm deteriorated further, the beeps coming faster now, more irregular, the waveform flattening into something that looked like the heart was trying to call for help but the call was breaking apart. O2 saturation? Hargrove said, his voice still measured, still controlled. Laura read the pulse oximeter. 88 and dropping. 90 seconds. That was all it took for a man's body to recognize that something was wrong with the pressure in his chest cavity. The right lung had collapsed. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of catastrophic speed that sent patients into the kind of shock that killed them in minutes. But relentlessly. Systematically. Pressure building where it shouldn't be, compressing the heart, restricting its ability to fill with blood, squeezing the oxygen out of everything that depended on it working correctly. Hargrove's composure remained intact, but his hands had stopped moving. He stood there holding nothing, his expression the expression of a man trying to remember a protocol he'd read about but never actually encountered. Around him, the machines continued their documentation. The monitor beeped faster. The oxygen saturation numbers fell like a countdown timer nobody had asked for. 84%, Laura said. Rebecca's hand found her father's shoulder. The Major's breathing had become rapid and shallow, his body doing what untrained bodies did when they panicked, hyperventilating, pulling in more air that couldn't actually help because the problem wasn't access to air, the problem was pressure. Laura moved. Not with hesitation. Not with the kind of slowness that came from a nurse double-checking protocol or waiting for a doctor to decide what to do. She moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from a senior chief petty officer who had stood in sandstorms while mortars landed close enough to feel the heat, who had worked by the light of a chemical glow stick while rounds went past overhead, who had learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury that people who were bleeding out couldn't afford. She crossed to the medication cart with 3 steps. Her hands knew exactly where the equipment was before she looked, 14-gauge angiocath needle, long enough to reach the pleural space, short enough to control. She found the alcohol pad and tore it open. The smell of isopropyl rose into the sterile air of the bay. "What are you doing?" Hargrove said. Laura didn't answer. She was already prepping the site, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact anatomical landmark where a needle could release pressure that was killing a man 3 feet away from her. She felt for the rib with her palpating hand. Found the space. Felt the depression where her needle would go. The Major's O2 sat was 78% now. Her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory didn't hesitate. It didn't wait for authorization from doctors who were standing there trying to remember what they'd learned in lectures 7 years ago. Muscle memory had been trained in field conditions where the attending physician was a guy with shrapnel in his thigh who was yelling coordinates for a medevac that wasn't coming for another 40 minutes. Muscle memory knew that talking was slower than acting. The needle went in at the second intercostal space with the kind of precision that made the attending physician, the one actually standing in the bay now, watching this nurse move like she'd done this before, like she'd done this dozens of times, take 1 step backward. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. The sound of pressure finding its way out of a space where it was killing someone. That sound came from his chest like a small, desperate voice saying thank you. The monitor's rhythm started to regularize almost immediately. The beep slowed. The waveform on the screen began to rebuild itself. The O2 saturation numbers that had been falling like a countdown timer stopped falling. 80%. 85%. 88%. The Major's breathing shifted. The rapid panic breathing stopped. His hand dropped from his chest. His eyes, which had been wide with the kind of fear that comes from sudden suffocation, began to focus again. "Let's get a chest tube set up," the attending physician said. Not a request. A command. He was already moving toward the supplies, already understanding that whatever protocol required doctor authorization for emergency decompression could wait until after the man could breathe again. Laura stepped back. The needle was doing its work, the pressure continuing to escape, the lung beginning to re-expand, the heart beginning to do its job properly again. She looked at the monitor. Looked at the patient. looked at the attending physician whose expression had moved from professional interest to professional shock. He was looking at her hands, at her face, at the way she'd moved, at the fact that she'd known exactly where to go and how to get there and when to push and when to be gentle, like her body had been trained in a language that most nurses never learned. Hargrove's face had gone very still. Rebecca was crying. Not the kind of tears that came from fear, but the kind that came from watching someone you loved stop dying. "Thank you," she said, looking directly at Laura. "Thank you so much." But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Hargrove. The worst part wasn't that his patient had almost died and been saved. The worst part was that the woman he'd been orchestrating out of this hospital, the woman he'd decided was a threat to his insurance fraud scheme, had just demonstrated in front of 3 witnesses and a cardiac monitor that she possessed medical knowledge that belonged only to people with advanced trauma training. The worst part was that his narrative, the one he'd been so carefully constructing about her being an unreliable nurse who deviated from protocol without authorization, had just been dismantled by her own hand saving a man's life. Laura turned toward the medication cart to document what she'd done. Her expression was unchanged. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just the simple, methodical composure of someone who'd done what needed doing and was already moving on to the next thing. She pulled up the chair beside the major's bed and began her post-procedure assessment. Heart rate 92 and stable. Respirations 18, regular. O2 saturation 96% and climbing. The kind of numbers that belong to a man who was going to live because someone had understood pressure and anatomy and the exact geometric precision required to relieve both. 30 seconds. That's all it took to change everything. And Dr. Hargrove, standing at the edge of the bay with his mouth in a straight line, understood perfectly that everything had just changed in ways he could not control. While Major cross-stabilized in the cardiac ICU under Laura's monitoring, his O2 saturation climbing steadily back to normal ranges, 95, 96, 97, Dr. Hargrove had already left the resuscitation bay and was moving through the hospital corridors like a man whose calculations had just been overturned. He didn't walk to his office. He walked to a quiet corner on the 3rd floor, the stairwell where pharmaceutical representatives never ventured, and made 3 phone calls with the precision of someone calling in debts he'd been saving for exactly this moment. First call, Richard Bancroft, Chief of Surgery at Scripps La Jolla. "Richard, it's Hargrove. Remember that cardiac catheterization equipment referral I sent your way? The one that added $2 million to your cardiac program?" Hargrove's voice was measured, almost reasonable. "I need a small favor. Employee reference call. Just tell them you're concerned about her reliability. That's all. You don't need to lie. Just express concern." Bancroft agreed without hesitation. Favor traded. Debt collected. Second call, Dr. Patricia Chen, Medical Director at Palomar Hospital in Escondido, 40 minutes north. "Patricia, Hargrove here. That Joint Commission waiver I expedited for your new wing? The one that saved you 6 months in bureaucracy. The same careful tone. The same mechanism. A reference inquiry would arrive at Palomar within the week. Laura's application, should she file one, would be tagged with subtle warnings about documentation inconsistencies and potential judgment lapses. Not disqualifying. Just concerning enough. Third call, Martin Sterling, Hospital Network Administrator and Board Member. "Martin, we need to bring in an outside investigator for a routine staff audit. Insurance purposes. I'll need to review one employee's complete patient interaction history for the past 18 months. Sterling was already nodding on the other end of the line. Laura knew nothing about it, and by Wednesday, an investigator named David Moss would arrive at Oak Creek Memorial with a mandate to examine her charting, her medication administrations, her patient assessments, looking not for actual violations but for anything that could be reframed as questionable judgment. The machinery of institutional destruction moved quietly. No shouting. No confrontation. Just 3 phone calls, 3 favors called in, and the systematic dismantling of a woman's professional existence began its quiet work while she was still in the ICU documenting Major Cross's vitals every 15 minutes. By Thursday afternoon, the investigator had already found his opening. Laura had administered 500 milliliters of normal saline bolus to a septic patient on Tuesday, textbook protocol for septic shock resuscitation, but Moss noted it as aggressive fluid administration without clear attending sign-off. Not a violation. Just a question. Just enough to create a file. Just enough for Hargrove to present to the board as evidence of pattern judgment issues. By Friday morning, the outside investigator had submitted a preliminary report flagging inconsistencies in clinical decision-making requiring further review, and HR had already begun drafting the separation paperwork. Laura didn't know any of this. She came to work Friday evening for her regular 7 p.m. shift, badge swiped at the turnstile, the fluorescent lights of the main corridor washing her face in white, harsh light. She made it to the break room, poured a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since 6 a.m., and that's when Patricia Martinez from Human Resources met her at the door with a folder in her hands and an expression that Laura had learned to read years ago, the look of someone delivering bad news they didn't personally believe in but were contractually obligated to execute. "Laura, I need you to come to my office," Patricia said quietly. "Not a question." Laura set down the coffee mug, the one with the faded "World's Okayest Nurse" inscription she'd found at a Target 3 years ago, and followed her down the corridor without speaking. The separation was efficient. 14 minutes. A printed letter citing documented concerns regarding clinical judgment and pattern inconsistencies identified during our recent compliance review. The investigator's report was attached, full of carefully worded observations that sounded damning when read aloud but wouldn't hold up to legal scrutiny if challenged. Laura's sparse list of professional references had yielded exactly what Hargrove needed: concern without specifics, doubt without evidence, the kind of shadow that lingers whether it's based on anything real or not. "You're terminated for cause," Patricia said, and Laura could hear the apology embedded in her voice. "I argued against this, Laura. I want you to know that." But the board voted 5-2 to accept the investigator's findings. Laura sat very still. Her hands were steady on the armrests of the chair. "I performed a needle decompression on Major Cross yesterday. Saved his life. That's in my charting." "I know," Patricia said. "I read it. It was extraordinary work." She paused. "That's actually what makes this worse. They're not trying to claim you're incompetent. They're trying to claim you make unilateral decisions without proper authorization. They're saying yesterday's heroic intervention was actually a violation of protocol." The rain started around 5:36 p.m., just as Laura was clearing out her locker. A Friday in late March, cold rain hammering the roof of Oak Creek Memorial like applause for a performance no one had volunteered to attend. She emptied the locker methodically. The spare scrub she kept for emergencies. A granola bar she'd forgotten about. A birthday card from the night shift nurses, signed 2 years ago before the ostracism had begun in earnest. She placed everything into a cardboard box, the kind hospitals used to transport files and specimen containers, not personal belongings. The box smelled like industrial bleach and old paper. By 6:44 p.m., standing at the bus stop on Ash Street with rain running down the cardboard and soaking the edges, Laura opened the box and looked inside. The World's Okayest Nurse mug was there, wrapped in paper towels she'd taken from the break room. A dying succulent, a small jade plant she'd been keeping on the window shelf, the leaves turning brown because she'd been too distracted to water it properly. And at the bottom, a photograph in a plastic sleeve, her and Corporal Martinez, both 26 years old, standing in front of a Humvee in Tikrit in 2006, his arm around her shoulder, both of them smiling in a way that seemed impossible now, the smile of people who didn't know yet what they would carry for the rest of their lives. Martinez had died 3 days after that photo was taken. An IED. She'd held his hand in the field hospital for 3 hours after he was already gone, not willing to let go, not willing to accept that some people don't make it home. She looked at the photo for a long moment, rain dripping from the cardboard box onto the plastic sleeve, and then she placed it back in the box and turned toward the bus that was pulling up to the stop. The next 3 weeks passed in a progression of cheap coffee, cheaper apartments, and the slowly crystallizing understanding that Hargrove's network was larger than she'd imagined. She applied to an urgent care clinic in Oceanside. The reference call came back with vague concerns about her suitability for fast-paced environments. She applied to a rural hospital in Julian. The same pattern. Within days, whispers preceded her, reliability questions, judgment concerns, nothing specific enough to be defamatory but effective enough to create hesitation. She burned through her savings in a studio apartment on Thorn Street with peeling wallpaper the color of old teeth and a window that faced an alley where homeless people slept in cardboard boxes she recognized from her own. On Tuesday evening, 3 weeks and 2 days after standing in the rain with a box of her life in her hands, her phone rang. Patricia from HR at Oak Creek Memorial. Laura, we have a staffing crisis. 2 nurses called out sick, both same day. 1 nurse was in a car accident this morning. Our evening shift is understaffed and we have admissions backed up. Patricia's voice was careful, as if she were walking on ice. I know how this looks, asking you back. But we need help. Cardiac unit specifically. Can you do an overnight shift? Laura almost said no. She almost hung up the phone and let the silence answer for her. But the apartment rent was due in 9 days and she had $847 left in her checking account, and pride was a luxury item she could no longer afford. Just until we stabilize, Patricia said, and it might have been the most honest thing either of them had said in weeks. Okay, Laura said. When? Tonight. 7 p.m. Can you make it? Laura was already looking for clean scrubs in her apartment, the muscle memory of the job overriding everything else. I'll be there. She walked back into Oak Creek Memorial at 6:52 p.m. on Tuesday evening, punched in her code at the time clock, the same code that should have been deactivated when they terminated her, but no one had thought to disable it, and moved into the cardiac unit as if she'd never left. The hallway was exactly as she remembered. The nurse's station smelled like hand sanitizer and old documentation. The monitors beat their steady rhythm from 6 different rooms. The world had not changed. Only she had, compressed into invisibility again, assigned to the overnight rotation, working in the margin hours when the hospital belonged to the skeleton crew. Major Cross was there. Readmitted for cardiac rehabilitation follow-up, for days post-procedure, his recovery textbook normal. His daughter Rebecca had been coming every evening, bringing him books and photographs, and Laura saw her only once, a dark-haired woman in her 30s who reminded her of someone she used to be, someone who still believed that survival meant you'd done something right. On Wednesday night at 8:17 p.m., a new patient arrived via humanitarian visa, a surgical transfer from the Federal Intake Center. His name was Khalid. He was 53 years old. And when Laura entered his room with a tablet and a blood pressure cuff, something in his face shifted like the moment before an earthquake, the moment when the ground remembers it's not as solid as everyone pretended. He sat up in the bed. His eyes went wide. You, he said in broken English, his voice rising with the weight of recognition that spanned 17 years. You are the one. The woman soldier from Tikrit. You saved the American major. You are ghost we could not kill. The shout echoed through the 3rd-floor corridor of Oak Creek Memorial like a gunshot in a canyon, turning every head within 20 feet. Laura's hand stilled above the medication cart. The voice behind her was rough, accented, speaking English like someone pulling words from a dictionary underwater. You are the one. The woman soldier from Tikrit. You saved the American major. You are ghost we could not kill. She turned slowly. A man stood in the hallway, early 50s, his face weathered like driftwood, one arm ending at the wrist. His eyes held the particular brightness of someone seeing a phantom made flesh. Laura's jaw clenched once, a single involuntary muscle contraction. Her hands curled into fists, then deliberately relaxed. The composure held. It had to hold. I think you have me confused, she said quietly, each word measured like medication by syringe. I'm just a nurse. No. The man shook his head with absolute certainty. No. I see the hands. I see the way you move. The way you breathe like soldier. I was there. Tikrit, 2011. The checkpoint outside Sadra City. 17 of us came out when only 4 should have come out. Because of you. Before Laura could respond, a voice called out from the patient room behind him. Dad. A woman emerged, 30s, with Major Cross's jawline and his eyes. Rebecca. Dad, you shouldn't be wandering. The physical therapist said. She stopped. Her gaze moved from the former combatant to Laura, and something in her expression shifted like a lock clicking into place. Oh my God. Rebecca pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. She scrolled through her notes app, then switched to her email, then to a folder labeled Classified Materials, Security Clearance Required. When she found what she was looking for, she turned the screen toward Laura. The image showed a younger woman, maybe 28, standing in desert camouflage with a helmet hanging from one hand. The face was sharper, harder, marked by the particular exhaustion that comes from making life-and-death decisions in real time. Laura's face. Unquestionably. Unmistakably. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Rebecca whispered. That's you. You're in the Defense Department database. You're in Dad's medical file as the primary responder during Operation Citadel. She looked up. You saved his life in Tikrit. You carried him 3 miles under fire. The corridor had gone absolutely silent. Nurses stopped moving. Orderlies froze mid-stride. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant, indifferent song above them, electric and impersonal and utterly uncaring about what was happening below. I need to finish the med cart, Laura said. The doors to the stairwell burst open before Rebecca could respond. A man in dress uniform entered with the bearing of someone accustomed to having rooms reorganize themselves around his presence. Commander James Rourke, Major Cross's former commanding officer, his chest a roadmap of ribbons and his face the color of mahogany leather. Behind him came hospital administration, Dr. Pembroke, the chief medical officer, Patricia from Human Resources, 2 men Laura recognized as security. Commander Rourke's eyes found her immediately. When he spoke, his voice carried through the corridor like a broadcast intended for everyone to hear. Senior Chief Bennett. Not a question. A recognition. I'm Commander James Rourke, 75th Ranger Regiment. I'm here to officially acknowledge your service record and to inform you that you are not only cleared for medical commendation, but you are being formally recognized for your actions both in Tikrit and here at this hospital. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. You earned a Navy Cross in 2011. 2 Silver Stars. A Purple Heart. Another Purple Heart. And you've been working as a floor nurse making $42,000 a year because you were running. Laura's voice didn't crack. Her hands didn't tremble. When she spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave, and the timidity that had defined her existence at Oak Creek Memorial for 18 months simply evaporated like morning mist. I don't want recognition, Commander. I want to do my job. Your job is to be seen, he said quietly. You've been invisible long enough. The security guard, the same man who had handed her a cardboard box 3 weeks earlier with the hospital's sympathies and a severance check, stepped forward. His expression was carefully neutral, professional, but something in his eyes suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. He was already moving toward Dr. Hargrove's office on the other side of the unit. 2 FBI agents appeared behind him, their credentials displayed with the casual authority of people accustomed to having doors open for them. The next voice came from the stairwell, transmitted through a radio on one guard's shoulder. We're executing the warrant now. Subject is in his office. Dr. Hargrove sat at his mahogany desk as the agents entered. His fingers had been reaching for his phone when they came through the door, reaching for Gerald Hutchins, for the board members who owed him favors, for the 3-year network of reciprocal obligations he'd constructed with the precision of a surgeon building an unseen architecture. Agent Fisher was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the expression of someone who had conducted approximately 8,000 conversations like this one. Dr. Hargrove, she said, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud in the amount of $473,000, wire fraud involving insurance companies in 5 states, and obstruction of justice. She placed the warrant on his desk. You have the right to remain silent. He tried anyway. His voice scraped out like gravel in a mixer. My lawyer. I need to call my lawyer. And Gerald Hutchins, he knows people, he can. Mr. Hutchins is also under investigation, Fisher said. She gestured to his phone. He reached for it. She took it from his hand as naturally as taking a child's toy. The board members you called are cooperating with federal agents. The investigator you hired to audit Senior Chief Bennett's record has been charged with falsifying documents. Your network isn't a network anymore, Doctor. It's evidence. In the hospital corridor, the security guard was already walking toward Dr. Hargrove's office, and he already had a cardboard box in his hands. The same cardboard box, probably. Laura watched him go. The box contained a life built on arrogance and entitlement, and the irony was so precise, so mathematically perfect, that she almost smiled. When the security guard emerged with Dr. Hargrove in handcuffs, the former medical director's face had the grey-white color of cooked fish. His eyes swept the hallway, looking for someone to call, some authority to invoke, some institutional leverage that suddenly no longer existed. The guard walked him toward the elevators with the same professional courtesy he'd extended to Laura 3 weeks earlier. I believe you know the way out, sir, the guard said quietly. The words were the same ones he'd spoken to Laura when her career had ended. This time, he meant them differently. 3 weeks turned into 3 months. Dr. Hargrove's medical license was revoked by the state medical board. His private practice dissolved like sugar in water. Criminal charges proceeded through federal court with the inexorable momentum of a boulder rolling downhill. Laura received a formal apology from Oak Creek Memorial's administration, full reinstatement with back pay, and an offer to establish a trauma medicine fellowship program bearing her name. She turned down the fellowship. She accepted the reinstatement, part-time, teaching trauma response at a private training center where she didn't have to be invisible but didn't have to be a legend either. She existed, somewhere between. 6 months after the reveal, an envelope arrived at her apartment with a White House return address. Inside was calligraphy on heavy stock paper, an invitation to a commendation ceremony in the East Room recognizing her ongoing contributions to military medicine and her recent heroic actions at Oak Creek Memorial. Laura held the invitation for 17 minutes without moving, standing in her apartment, the combat boots now displayed in a shadow box on her wall next to Marcus's photograph, Marcus who had died in Tikrit while she held compression on a wound that was already beyond compression. The White House East Room was filled with dress uniforms, 3-star generals, and dignitaries whose names appeared in newspapers. Laura stood in her navy dress uniform, the ribbons across her chest telling stories she'd finally begun to acknowledge. Major Cross stood beside her in his Army service uniform, fully recovered, his forearm bearing the tattoo of her name like a permanent badge of gratitude. The Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness read her commendation aloud. Tikrit. The lives saved. The continued service through adversity. The needle decompression that had saved Major Cross's life a second time in a San Diego hospital. As he spoke, Major Cross turned to her, tears streaming down his face, and whispered, "I knew your name. I just couldn't find you." Laura took his hand. "I couldn't find myself either," she whispered back. "But I think I'm ready now." The audience stood for applause. Commander Rourke saluted from the second row. Rebecca, sitting in the front, mouthed "thank you" through her tears. After the ceremony, Laura and Major Cross stood in the hallway outside the East Room. He showed her his forearm tattoo again, the name that had never left him even when his mind couldn't place her face. "Every day I lived after Tikrit," he said, "I lived because of you. My daughter knows her father because of you. I got to walk her down the aisle because of you." Later, as Laura paused on the White House steps looking back at the building's stone facade, she thought about Dr. Hargrove at his folding table outside a strip mall, business cards spread before him like a surrender. She thought about the nurses who had abandoned her in break rooms, about the woman she was in Tikrit and the woman she had been at Oak Creek, invisible, diminished, buried under the weight of a past she couldn't carry anymore. Rebecca joined her on the steps. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Laura smiled slightly. "That true class is what you do when the lights go out. And I've been in the dark long enough." They walked together into the daylight, the shadow of the White House behind them, the combat boots retired but not forgotten, the past acknowledged but no longer crushing. Laura Bennett was visible again, by choice this time, carrying her truth instead of running from it. The woman she was becoming had nothing left to prove and everything left to live for. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated and proven them wrong, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Like this video. Comment below, what would you have done in Laura's position? And share this with someone who needs to know they're not invisible, even when they're trying to be.